In this lesson, we'll implement a very basic ID generator so that the new entries that we create have also a unique ID. If you were connecting your application to the cloud, normally the cloud would give you the ID of each element, and when you create a new element, the cloud will return an ID for this new element. But if you're doing an offline application, you will have to generate your own local ways to identify each element so that you can have, say, routes to edit an element or to delete an element and whatnot. So let's start by defining another method in our service, which will be called getNewID. Every time that you call this method, you'll get a new unique identifier. The first time that we call this method, what we'll do in it is find the largest existing ID and add one. When you call it after that, it'll just add one to that previous new ID. So the first thing we'll check is whether this new ID is defined. If it's already defined, then we'll increase its number by 1 and return it to the user so that they get the newest ID. That's a new unique ID. As I mentioned, if we haven't created this yet, we need to grab the largest existing ID, add 1. We'll use a method from the underscore library that we're including in our project called max. This method, what it does, it iterates through a collection of objects and it will find the object that has the highest value for a certain property that we specify. The object with the highest ID will be called entry max ID, and we'll get it from the underscore library. You always start with the underscore, that's the name of the object the library provides. The method is called max. We'll iterate through service.entries, right? That's our collection. And on each one of them, we want to grab its ID so that this will give us the object with the largest ID. Now, the ID that I'm going to save is going to be equal to the ID of that object plus 1. Easy. And we return this to the user. Let's test this in the console. Remember how we can get access to the service, and we can of course get access to everything that service has, to all the methods that it has. So see how I'm calling it the first time, it gives me 7, the maximum was 6, it added 1. If we call it again, 8, 9, 10. Cool. Now we want a new ID generated for every new expense that we create. So that's very simple to implement. We have our save method here, which is to create a new entry. And we can access that entry, access its ID, which it doesn't exist at the moment, because if I create one now and I access all my entries, you'll see that, say, the first one has an ID of 1, but the last one doesn't have one. So we want it to have one. Now it will have one. Entry.id equal service.getNewID. And now our new entries are going to have an ID. Let's make sure that's working. And yes, see how now we get ID 7, and if we create another one, it would be ID 8, and so forth.